Do I go out?
Sí.
Okay. Off to a good start. Well, hello, everyone. There are moments in human history when stating simple facts can be a revolutionary act. And this is one of them. So, global emissions per capita of carbon have increased from 1900 to 2018. And what that means is that the amount of carbon that each individual emits has been increasing. The global population will continue to increase until the end of the century. So it's not a surprise, then, that the total emissions that have occurred since we agreed globally that we would limit and stabilize emissions has continued to increase. And the only moments at which emissions have actually declined have been in moments of economic collapse or political turmoil. Not because of any policy interventions or agreements that the nations of the world have made. Now, the problem is made all the worse by the fact that the carbon dioxide problem is a stock problem, not a flow problem. And so, even if we reduce emissions, carbon can still concentrate in the atmosphere, since molecules of carbon dioxide can live in the atmosphere for decades or even centuries. So reducing emissions is like turning the faucet on a bathtub. You might reduce the flow of water into the bathtub, but the amount of water that's building up in the bathtub may still continue to increase. And indeed, what we know is that carbon dioxide has continued to increase in the atmosphere for decades and decades and decades now. And unsurprisingly, the Earth's temperature has continued to increase in line with these concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, I think most of us know that 2023 was a really weird year. And in fact, 2023 is the warmest year on record. But what's surprising about 2023 is it's not just the warmest year on record, but it's the warmest year on record by quite a lot. And the question we now face, really, is whether this extreme of 2023 will now just begin to inflect downward and still be warmer, will continue the upward climb in temperature, or whether we've now entered a period where the warming will increase exponentially from the warming that's already occurred. Now, what's particularly depressing about this, for those of us who work on climate change, is it's not a state secret that emitting carbon causes climate change. This is something we've known for a long time. And in 1988, on the front page of the United States' foremost newspaper, the New York Times, there was a headline that global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. But yet, we have continued this upward climb. Now, this slide is a somewhat complicated slide, but if I were to show one image to anyone to indicate the level of societal failure with respect to climate change, it would be this one. So what those colors are telling us is the degree of warming. So what we've seen is we've gone from relatively little warming to a very high level of warming. What the upward slope of the curve is telling us is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what those points are telling us on the curve is they're marking dates in which we released scientific reports about climate change, when there were meetings of the Conference of the Parties and agreements were made about limiting climate change. And essentially, all three of these things have gone up together. Now, correlation is not causation, but if we were simply to show this graph and remove the text, and you were to ask someone, what do these three things have in common? What's the relationship? You might even come to the conclusion that meetings of the conferences of the parties with respect to climate change may cause climate change. Right? That's how much lockstep diplomatic meetings, greenhouse gas emissions, and global warming have gone together. It's important to recognize the degree and the seriousness of the failure. Now, we need to recognize and accept the fact that climate change is an incredibly difficult problem. As animals, we did not evolve to respond to the buildup of tasteless, odorless gases in the atmosphere. If carbon dioxide were some sickly, terrible purple color and smelled bad, rather than an invisible gas, perhaps we would have done something about it. But climate change is not the only problem that we face. It's not the only global transformation that is underway. We're living in this moment in which there are enormous changes in the fundamental Earth system, and there are enormous and profound changes in social and economic systems as well. And we can present the results of these changes in a series of graphs like this, but we can also see the results of these changes in images like this one. Today, less than 4% of the biomass of terrestrial mammals is composed of free-ranging, non-human animals. The rest of the mammal biomass on the planet are humans and domestic animals and livestock. That's the degree to which the human footprint on the planet has driven out other wild things, other wild mammals. Now, I'm going to use this word extractivism, which is a word that has come to be a highly theorized concept and is used in important but complicated ways. But I'm going to use it in a very simple way. So I'm going to talk about extractivism as an ideology, a worldview, a set of ideas that rationalizes or justifies extracting maximal economic benefit from nature. This idea of extractivism, as I'm using it, is not really very different from how some people think about economic efficiency. Now, the problem that we face is that our decision-making systems either incentivize extractivism or fail to set limits on it. So the sort of centerpiece of our systems of decision-making with respect to extractivism is essentially economics. And we all know that there are market failures, that economic transactions create externalities. All of this is heavily theorized in economic articles and in textbooks. But the fact of the matter is that these externalities are often quite diffuse and quite distant, and in fact are not internalized, they're not compensated for, they're not anticipated up front by economic decision making. And we also know that very high discount rates on what happens to the future effectively disenfranchises future people. And we can go through other systems of decision making. I mean, law, for example, is about resolving disputes between existing parties. It's not about future generations. It's not about non-human nature. Our political systems essentially represent whoever shows up to vote, and we know how difficult that can be in political systems such as Chile's and in those of most other countries, where there is a positive correlation between income and the likelihood of voting. But when it comes to, again, future generations or people across borders and boundaries who are affected by the actions of a political community, they're not represented. And the ethics that we live with is not very different from the moral code that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, kind of a series of negative imperatives. And yet those moral prohibitions were created in a world in which there were about 50 million people, and bronze smelting essentially was the example of a cutting-edge, innovative, disruptive technology. Now, at this point, I think one of the major challenges to this way of looking at nature, to extractivism, is the rights of nature movement, which is a movement for which indigenous people in particular are at the center of. And the rights of nature movement has been enormously influential. And so if we just kind of map this out, we see that rights of nature laws have been gaining traction really all over the world. But of course, the real home of the rights of nature movement is in South America. And the center of the center is, of course, Ecuador, where the rights of nature have been enshrined in the Ecuadorian Constitution. And in fact, there have been two very important cases that have been decided by the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court. And I must say that the quality of legal reasoning and argumentation in these decisions have been very high. They've not only made important and interesting decisions, in one case, for example, forbidding a Canadian mining company from extracting copper and gold in the Los Cedros National Park in Ecuador. But not only has the level of legal reasoning been very high, but the idea of rights of nature enshrined in the Ecuadorian Constitution has actually had real legal teeth. It's made a difference in terms of what has been happening in that society. But when you use the language of rights, certain questions arise. We have, again, very well theorized notions of rights. And if we're going to talk about rights of people, if we're going to talk about rights of animals, if we're going to talk about rights of nature, we need to be able to answer questions like, what is the ground of these rights? How do we know who has these rights? Do individual trees have rights? Do forests have rights? Do species have rights? Do individuals have rights? We need to know how much protection these rights provide. We need to know what to decide in cases of conflict. Ecological succession is simply a natural part of how the world works. Does a successor ecosystem violate the rights of a predecessor ecosystem? We need to know how to answer those questions. And the questions continue. Now, already in 1977, an American political scientist, John Rodman, had asked the question about whether rights is really the right concept, the right language for thinking about substantial protections of nature. And in fact, Rodman kind of speculated that that the solution to these kind of moral, political, legal problems that we face may not be in more morality, more ethics, more law, but may actually involve necessarily some broader change of consciousness and worldview. And, that critique can be extended in various ways. In the way that we think about ourselves on an everyday basis, the way that we think about ethics and politics, we tend to think of ourselves as isolated individuals that sort of move around the world like billiard balls, causing things to happen. If I violate your space, you may sue me, and so on and so forth. But you might think that there's something just wrong with that worldview, that we are necessarily relational with respect to each other in the world, that the boundaries between us are not as sharp as we conceptualize them in politics and law. And in fact, trying to protect the entire world through a system of law might actually be like trying to do brain surgery with a chisel. Not exactly the right instrument. So what I want to do is to try to bring into the conversation a kind of old notion, one that's pretty universal in human experience, and it's the idea of the sacred. Now, the idea of the sacred is, of course, a religious notion, but it's not, just a religious notion. It's one that has also had life in the secular world. Probably it's to you, you would most associate it with the recent writings of Pope Francis, Laudato Si. But we can also associate it with the worldviews and belief systems of indigenous peoples. This is Uluru in Australia, which is a sacred site for indigenous people in Australia. We can also distinguish different senses in which you might think of nature as being sacred. In one sense, you might think of nature being sacred in the sense of Earth's fundamental systems, the atmospheric system, the ocean system, the hydrological systems as being sacred. And that's the sense of the sacred in which indigenous traditions have often thought about Mother Earth. These are the systems that give rise to all of life on Earth. They are the fundamental conditions of existence for us on the planet. But we can also think of nature as being sacred in terms of particular spaces, particular places, particular animals, particular species. And that's the sense of the sacredness of nature that has gone into some legislation like that of the American Endangered Species Act. Now, the point I want to make here is that to take something as sacred doesn't mean you can never in any way transgress it. For example, if you're a practicing Catholic and you're starving to death and the only thing you can possibly eat to survive are communion wafers, you might eat the communion wafers even though you think they're sacred. And similarly, Orthodox Jews who do not use electrical devices on the Sabbath might do so if someone is having a heart attack. Sometimes you do need to use the sacred. Life lives on life, and you need to use the sacred in order to survive. But viewing something, what viewing something as sacred does imply is that any old cost-benefit analysis is not enough to transgress on the sacred. You don't, for example, sacrifice your mother because somebody's willing to give enough money to you for doing so you could use the money to buy another mother or something like that. The sacredness of the relationship implies that it's simply not up for grabs in terms of a financial calculation. But sometimes we do have to balance what's sacred against other things that we regard as sacred, or what's necessary for survival, and so on. But those decisions are always going to be difficult and generally even be tragic in many cases. So there's a movie by Werner Herzog called Where the Green Ants Dream, which I think does a good job of illustrating how profoundly difficult these decisions can be. In this movie, an Australian mining company wants to extract some part of the earth, for the export industries. But for the Aboriginal people, this is where the green ants dream. It's a sacred place, and it's the sort of fate of the world depends on respecting the sanctity of this place. And you can imagine trying to make a decision here, right? Trying to resolve this conflict. There's no way of resolving this conflict that isn't in some way going to be tragic in some way, because the worldviews are so profoundly difficult. But I want to suggest that once you view nature as sacred, and some places as sacred, that is beyond benefit-cost analysis, some things are not so complicated. Like using the Atacama as essentially a global waste dump for the residue of fast fashion that's imported from the rest of the world is obviously going to violate any idea of what it might be to view this part of nature as being sacred. Other things are much more difficult. So, for example, it was extremely difficult to stop the Dominga project in Chile. It was difficult for multiple reasons. There were real benefits to be gained from the project, and the project had already been approved by many levels of government and regulation. And some things are not only difficult, but they're also extremely complicated. And one of those issues concerns the issue of lithium mining, where on the one hand, we're talking about places that are sacred, in many cases to indigenous people, where livelihoods depend on water. We're also talking about materials that at this moment are vital to the global energy transition that's required to deal with the issue of climate change that I was mentioning. But we're also dealing with issues about Chilean economic development, about whether Chile can move from simply being a country whose economy is centered on these purely extractive industries to an economy where Chile does value-added manufacturing, for example, and fabricating batteries, and perhaps in the future manufacturing electric cars. These are really difficult issues. And the choices that are involved here are tragic choices. And it may be that good decisions that are made will not in the end fully succeed. But back to the hard truths. We're living in a world in which change is not optional. This is an image from my hometown of New York during Hurricane Sandy. Essentially, the sea just ripped its way into parts of the city that were meant to be dry for most of us. And this is an image just from last year with the fires that occurred in Chile. And of course, we're going to be seeing much more with respect to these fires and this incredible ecological change as climate change increases. I grew up in California, and the ecological systems in places like Yosemite National Park, where I used to hike and go backpacking, are almost unrecognizable to me now from what they were in my childhood. Now, Chile, to its credit, has done something that most other countries have not done, including the United States, and that is to pass a basic law, framework law, governing decision-making with respect to climate change. This is a very important first step, but it is, in the final analysis, a baby step. It's a necessary condition. It's important to do, but it just provides a platform for addressing these incredibly difficult choices that are going to have to be made as we transition into a radically different world than the one that certainly people my age grew up in, took for granted, and thought in some way was permanent. So the future will be difficult. The path is uncharted. There's no simple course. But one thing that we know is that the kind of resilience that we need in a climate change world is not going to be given to us by extractivism. Extractivism is the antithesis to resilience. So, as nature resists, as nature is resilient, so we must be resilient. And thank you all for your attention.